Hi, friends. I'm Amy with Passings. If you've been with Passings a while, you know that our tagline is support for each of life's transitions. And on the day I'm filming this, which is Sunday, March 29th, 2020, we are all in the midst of a transition, the magnitude of which we don't yet understand and have never experienced before, at least in our lifetime. We are going through this pandemic, and that word sounds kind of scary, but I want to break it down for you. It's from the Greek. Demos is the part that translates into demic, and it just means people, group of people. It's the foundation for the word democracy as well. So people, and then pan means every or all. So all that word means, pandemic, is all the people. We're all going through this time of upheaval and chaos and fear and death and destruction to our ways of life and connection and beauty and joy and love, all of that. And we have so much available to us in terms of wisdom from folks who live in a time of transition. So those of you who have a chronic illness, those of you who live with a terminal diagnosis, those of you who are caregivers for someone experiencing that, any of those situations, and those of you who are bereaved, you hold wisdom for us. You know what it's like to live in this particular kind of transition. So all of us go through transitions, but most of us know, for most of the transition of our lives, we know, or we think we know, where we're starting at the beginning and where we're ending. So when we transition to a new job, we know what that looks like. When we transition out of high school into the world after high school, there's an end to that. We know we have our graduation date and then life changes. So for a lot of our transitions, we have rituals and we have physical determiners that let us know when this time of change will end. With this pandemic and with each of the transitions I mentioned before, chronic and terminal illness, caregiving for someone with chronic and terminal illness, bereavement, we live in a time of transition and we don't know what the end will be. We don't know when the end will be. Because of that, those of you who have been through any of those situations or are currently going through that have tools that the rest of us could use. We at Passings are really grateful for those tools. We are creating this series of videos. I'm calling it Living Here Now, COVID-19 as Personal and Collective Transition. And I'll make 3 more videos. Today we'll do the introductory one. We'll have one video that focuses on living, one on here, and one on now. So living here now. And those are such big things to talk about. Living, our beingness. Here, what is here? The concept of space, the experience of space. Now, likewise, the concept and the experience of time. Those are big, what I call pretzel-y things. That means my brain gets into a little bit of a pretzel when I try to think about them too much. And that pretzel's good. So in order for us to talk about these untalkable things, we're going to use stories. Stories are one of our greatest tools. And those of you who find yourselves at home right now with a lot of time on your hands with little ones or with loved ones who you normally don't spend so much time with, you might be already noticing that you're telling more stories, or perhaps you're reading more stories. Maybe you're listening to more stories in a more deep concentrated way than you ever have before. That's certainly happening at our house. What we're going to do with this series of videos is to focus on stories from our wisdom holders. And those wisdom holders are people I know, people who I have companioned through the last 20 years, through these big transitions of serious illness, bereavement, and caregiving. We'll have stories from my life because I happen to know them the best. Again, 20 years of collected stories. And we'll also turn to stories of transition that we get from our elders and sages throughout all of time. Lots and lots of stories that help us know we're not alone. This pandemic is totally new. This virus is totally new. But people across time and space have lived through this kind of transition where they didn't know what was happening, what would happen, where there was fear and joy and chaos and love all at the same time. So we're going to turn to some of those stories. And as we do, I want to invite you to pay attention to them, perhaps in a different way than you're used to. Especially in modern times, we have so many stories offered to us. My family and I, every time when we sit down to watch a show recently, we kind of stare at each other for a good amount of time and think and ask each other, which story should we watch? There are so many. We live in a time of abundant stories. And what I find myself doing sometimes is just consuming those stories as if they're like potato chips, empty nutrition. I'm going to ask you to contemplate the stories that I tell you, but all the stories in your world. The story that your beloved tells you about their time at work in the office today, or the story that your child tells you about the little bug that they saw on the ground. Any story that comes your way, I'm going to invite you to pay attention a little bit more deeply than perhaps we're used to in our contemporary times. And I'm going to ask you to contemplate using a very ancient way of integrating these stories. So rather than just ingesting and consuming, one is to actually be conscious of digesting and metabolizing these stories and paying attention to all of the richnesses offered in each of them. In the Jewish tradition, in the Hebrew tradition, there's a fundamental way of looking at stories that is so important and such a great tool for all of us, whether you're Jewish or not. That's called midrash. And the belief, the truth, is that each story is a multifaceted gem. Each of us has a little tiny bit of a facet of that. When we integrate that story, when we listen, we have our own viewpoint on that story. And when we come together and share those points with this in mind, with the idea that we're expanding our viewpoint by sharing them, then we're adding to the facets of that beautiful gem. We already do this, right? When we walk out of a movie that we've seen with somebody and we say, oh my gosh, what did you think of such and such? Or when we're in a book club, we read a little bit differently and we expand our understanding or our relationship with that text because it's enhanced by all of the different viewpoints shared. This is not the same as when we try to convince somebody else that our viewpoint of something is correct. If we have an opinion about what that movie is supposed to mean, that's not what I'm talking about here. This is about sharing, hey, this is what it means to me today. What does it mean to you? And really listening and expanding. So I invite you to play with that midrash. You are welcome to email me your bits of midrash on any of these stories that I share in this video or this whole series of 4 videos. I'm going to start by telling you a story from my world that keeps coming up in my mind and in my heart during these days of our pandemic, of our all people togetherness. In the summer of 2020, so almost 20 years ago, I was waiting. The time for my little family felt very similar to what's happening here on a super teeny tiny scale. I had an open lung biopsy because I was very, very sick, and my doctors were troubled. They didn't know what was happening to me. So they did an open lung biopsy, and the diagnosis that came back was confusing and upsetting to them. So I was diagnosed with a very rare situation. I don't even call it a disease because it's more like a cluster of symptoms that at that point only 12 people had had. And very rarely did any two of those people get it in the same way. So some people had this situation, this cluster of some symptoms happen because of a certain reaction to chemotherapy. Some had it idiopathically. We don't know how they got it. With me, it was very clear to my doctors that something had happened inside my chest. I have a calcification of the middle of my chest. And that was causing this cluster of symptoms. That's what led to this diagnosis. So knowing that, they thought, okay, well, we think we might be able to do something with that cluster in the middle of her chest, with this egg, I call it, a calcified mass. But my doctors in Oklahoma weren't willing to try anything. Thankfully, they weren't expert enough in this kind of care. So they had recommended that I go out of state to a different state, to Minnesota, to an institution called the Mayo, and specifically see one doctor, in hopes that they could do something with this mass in the center of my chest and therefore halt or at least slow down this cluster of symptoms, which to everyone else so far had caused death. So in the month of July, I was waiting, very much like we all are. My world was as tiny as many of yours are in this moment. I stayed home. I was so sick I couldn't go anywhere. I either stayed home or in my yard with my then husband and our son, who was 14 months in July. My world had gotten so tiny. And it was a time of waiting. We didn't know the outcome of any of this. Would the doctor say he could see me? We didn't know. If he did bring me to Minnesota, would I survive the trip? We didn't know. Did he have an answer? We didn't know. When would this all end? When would this time of waiting end with some kind of shift? We didn't know. When we're in these bigger transitions, that's always the case. So countless times, family members at the deathbed of their beloved family member have asked me, when will they pass? When will he die? When will she die? And truly, we don't know. Of course, we have signs and little symbols that let us know that it's about to happen, but we can't give a time and a date. Some people like to make stories around that. Oh, she'll die when she has, seen her sister who's arriving tomorrow. We don't know any of that. None of that do we know. And what I always try to listen to when people ask me that question about when will this change, when will something happen, I try to listen to whatever's beneath the question. So those of us who right now, the end of March or April, whenever you're watching this, we're wanting to know, when will we go outside again and meet our friends? When will my daughter go back to school? Will she ever go back to school? What we're asking is, when will I stop feeling this discomfort? And I was very much in that place at the time of that summer of 2020. When will I get the phone call that either says come or don't come? I had to be constantly ready for that new state of being, for that change, but I didn't know when it was happening. In the midst of all this, and our days spent mostly outside because I had a little one and he loved to look at bugs and grass and flowers. It was summertime. In the midst of all this, we met a little friend. And this little teeny tiny friend was a kitten, a black kitten. And he was very young, we could tell, and he looked sickly. And we decided as a family we wanted to take him into our home. We fell in love with him instantly. because we already had a cat, we knew we needed to make sure that he had nothing communicable, and we needed to make sure that he was healthy. So my husband took this cat to the vet, who said this cat is really sick, has something called feline leukemia. However, with the tests I've run, I believe that we can turn that course around. I think that if we do a series of medications within a certain amount of time, we will help this kitten live. I feel convinced. So when I heard that news, I immediately made a story about it. So we took the little kitten into our home. We named him Rascal, which was short for Raphael Asclepius, a very big name for a teeny tiny kitten. And I named him that because Raphael is an archangel who is particularly associated with healing, and Asclepius is the Greek god of healing. So I thought, okay, we're not only going to use this big name to signify this cat's healing, we're going to bring this cat back to life. The doctor has said it can be done, we will do it. And then that, here's a huge leap, that will be the metaphor, and that will be the instigation of my own healing, right? Totally made up story. I was not in the present at all. I was way far in the future, already looking back and making meaning, making sense of this time in my life. I would be healed just like this little kitten, and life would go on and everything would be perfect. So one day I was sitting and holding the kitten and doing all the things that we were told to do. And it became clear to me that my story was absolutely not what was happening. Even the veterinarian story was not what was happening. In that moment, it became clear to me from somewhere inside me, somewhere outside of me, I don't know, that still small voice that some of us talk about. I knew this kitten was dying. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could either stick to my story. I could be in denial of what was happening and stick to my story and try to make this cat live. It wouldn't have worked, but I could have tried. And plenty of us do this. We go into denial about what's happening because we're so attached to our story. The story we've written from the present, but the vantage point is the future, some unknown, unlived, impossible future. We get so wed to that story that we deny what's happening right now. I've done it countless times, but thankfully in this moment I didn't. For some reason, some burst of insight or who knows what, terror perhaps, I realized that I needed to drop that story that was gone. And in that moment, I realized, okay, what I can do is be here now with this sweet little being who is dying. And because of that, especially my son and I got to hold a being and nurture and midwife it onto the next plane, whatever that is. My son was around death in that moment in a way that he had not been before and has not been since, but will soon be because he deals with the dying a lot. He's a hospice volunteer. We decided, he and I, that we would love on this cat, that this cat deserved to be journeyed with through whatever happened, regardless of our story. I've been thinking of that cat, that little cat we called Rascal, short for Raphael Asclepius, a lot during this time of pandemic, because I've witnessed myself frequently and others in my life and on all kinds of social media and traditional media. I've witnessed us doing what I did with Rascal, and that is writing the story of now from some imagined future place, trying to understand and make meaning and have a perspective on now that we really can't have. This became really apparent to me through a series of exchanges with a dear friend of mine. She said to me, first on social media and then through emails and conversations on video, she said, "Hey, what are you thinking about this idea that's popping up everywhere that the planet is cleansing itself through this pandemic?" And I had seen those videos. I see the videos of the dolphins back in the canals in Venice, and my heart soars. And I have read about the decreased pollution over China. I see all that stuff, and in the moment I am thrilled. But what I'm trying to do is not make that into some story. We don't know. We don't know how this story ends. I'm also trying to be really cautious about the language I use to discuss all of this. So when someone says the planet is being cleansed, and I think of the elderly folks or the young folks or the who are dying right now due to COVID-19, those two stories don't fit together for me, and I can't make them fit together. When I think about the people whose lives are so disrupted in dangerous ways, people whose livelihood has now been taken from them, people who do not have a safe home to shelter in, it doesn't help me to go into the future and make some rosy story about the planet is being cleansed and the planet is healthier now. I can hold both of those things if I stay in the present. I can hold that maybe in the future we'll look back, long time in the future, years in the future, we'll look back and see, oh, there were things that happened that were good. We're seeing things that are happening that are good right now when people are helping their neighbors out. People are getting closer together with people than they've ever been, even though they can't see them right now. So beauty's happening right now, but we don't need to make that into the story. So we don't need to do what I did with Rascal, try to make it into a story. And this is really hard for us as humans. We are great at making stories and learning the lessons. And that's what I did with Rascal. I am super good at this. We'll talk about this in the next video, which is called Living. I'm thinking about subtitling it Confessions of a Reforming Compulsive Meaning Maker. We'll talk about that next time. I was a good student always. As an undergrad, I was an art history major and a literature major. So I was taught to understand the story behind things, story behind the text, the story behind the image. I'm good at it. I can look at something and make up a story and say, that makes sense. We all can do that. And when we do it as a form of escape, that's a little dangerous. What I mean by that is just like my family members who are asking me, when will my grandma die? When will my wife die? When is my husband going to be out of this pain? What we're really asking is, when can I stop feeling this particular flavor of discomfort? So that with those of us who we find making meaning of the stories before they've even played out, we might want to caution ourselves and pull ourselves back and say, wait a minute, am I doing this so I won't feel the discomfort of now? I certainly was with Little Rascal. I didn't want to feel this discomfort of, I don't know if I'm going to live past this summer. I don't know if I'm going to see my son grow up. But all of the data said, no, I certainly was not. I don't know what kind of pain is in store for me for the rest of my journey. I didn't want to live there. So I catapulted myself into some future and made up a story looking back. Wasn't true. It's totally fine to do it. We do it. It's natural. What I'm inviting each of us, myself especially, to do is when I notice I'm doing that a lot, is to maybe pause and ask myself, or get my beloved to ask me, is there anything you're not wanting to feel? Is there any reason you don't want to be here now? And there's a host of them, and they're all valid. My invitation is just notice. Just notice, why are you making up the story? Why are we making up the story as a collective already? We don't know. We don't know anything that's happening. Now, when my friend asked me, what do you think about all these, these stories we're hearing about the planet doing so well, I said, I'm reluctant to have any one fixed viewpoint yet. It's so funny, I kept using my hands because what I was describing is using some kind of fantastical tool that I don't think exists, but that allowed me to telescope out to huge picture, what's happening on the global scale, and then allowed me to come back to what I'm calling the naked eye scale, so telescope size, and then the naked eye, what's happening in my body, what's happening in my home right now, and then allowed me to go into what I'm calling the microscopic, to this place that's so still and so quiet in me, that we will talk about throughout this series, this place that connects me to other people who aren't here right now, to other people who are no longer even living, to vast amounts of information that's out there. So I wanted a telescope and a naked lens and a microscope all together in one tool, and I had no word for that. Maybe it exists. I don't think it does, but I had no word, and I kept doing this with my hands. This is what I'm trying to do, is use this tool I don't know even exists. And then I realized, of course it exists. We humans are that tool. As humans, we are incredibly blessed and cursed because we know that we have a perspective. Most of us of a certain age and a certain cognitive ability are able to realize that we have a perspective on something. No other living being can do that. My guinea pigs upstairs right now are not thinking about their viewpoint on anything. They don't know that. It's a meta level of thinking that's quite advanced. Because of that, we can change our perspective. We can change, just like with the little gem of a story that we do midrash on, we can take the present moment and do the same thing. We can change what we're looking through all the time. And that's a beautiful, beautiful gift. It's magic. And like all kinds of magic, it's a little dangerous too. So when I find myself in trouble is when I get stuck looking through one view, when I'm stuck at the present moment, and when I'm stuck with the naked eye, and I'm perseverating on my difficulty breathing this week, and is it related to COVID, and did I somehow get in touch with some of that? Or I can get stuck looking through the telescope at the big view and looking at those numbers and the graphs and the charts that overwhelm me. What I try to do then is to change the lens, because I have this magic tool, and so do you. We need people looking through specific lenses right now, and we have them, thank goodness. So we need the folks who are in laboratories right now looking through the microscope at this very virus, right? We need them. We need them to understand how it works, how it lives, what to best do about it. And we thank God. I thank God for them every day. We need the people whose view has to be the big view. We need the people who are infectious diseases specialists who look at the infectious disease from a broad viewpoint. How does it work within big populations? We need historians of science who can tell us this is how others have been dealt with, and this is what worked and this is what didn't. We need policymakers to be looking at big pictures about how this affects the economy and how we can help the people whose worlds have just fallen apart. And we also need people who are constantly looking through the naked lens, the naked eye lens that I'm talking about, and those are the folks who are caring for our folks, our people. We need the medical professionals, doctors, nurses, CNAs. We need medical technicians. We need the people who are feeding our sick and who are cleaning up after them in the hospitals. We need the people who are taking care of all of our forms right now. We need the people who are working in grocery stores and driving trucks and making deliveries. Those people are forced to stay in the naked eye lens. So we need people at all of those places. I am so blessed to not be only in one of those places. So when I'm hospice chaplain and when I'm a spiritual director, I'm in this moment with that person. And when my family and I talk about how are we going to best keep me away from this condition, and my daughter who has asthma, so we're both high risk. When we make a plan for how to gather our groceries and interact with the world, we need to be in this moment. We need to be in the naked eye view. We also are able and really fortunate to be able to look at big view and tiny view. That's what we're going to talk about through these 3 videos. How do we do that? We're going to use stories to get us into all of those different pieces, all of those different viewpoints, to turn and see a new facet. There are 2 different concepts I want to talk about, 2 different realities that I'll expand on in each of the videos. And they both have to do with time and space and being. So every one of our 3 words, our 3 concepts, living here now. And those 2 different terms are tangible and liminal. The tangible world is the world that we can see, touch, feel, that we experience through our senses. The liminal world is the world that is unseen, that is unknown through senses, but not unknown. So that word liminal is a great word, and it comes from the Latin. And it comes from the Latin word limen or limon, and that's the word for threshold of a building, a very tangible word for a tangible thing. And that word has, over the past 2,000 years, come to mean the threshold between 2 states of being, between 2 times, between 2 spaces. So when we are in any kind of transition, my daughter about to graduate from high school is in a liminal space, right? Those of you who are sick right now live in a liminal space. Those of us who are bereaved, that's a liminal space. We don't have to live in either the liminal or the tangible. We're actually always in both. The liminal, though, is something we can visit, something we're pulled into. We'll talk about this a lot in our last video called Now. The liminal contains all possibility. So when Rascal showed up at my door, I was in a liminal space. Him appearing was a tiny little liminal space. This was all possibility. Is he going to live? Is he going to die? Am I going to live? Am I going to die? I tried to make it tangible by making it make sense in time and space. When I realized he was dying, though, I was able to be in both the tangible now and here and the liminal. What I mean by that is I was able to hold his very real, very tangible body that was losing its life force moment to moment. It was very tangible. There was nothing that couldn't be seen or felt about that, holding this little kitten, talking to my son about it, explaining death to my 14-month-old. That was all very tangible, but there was also something liminal. In that time, I was connecting with, now I can make sense of it in terms of me connecting with my inner knowing about living and dying that I hadn't experienced in that way before, but I was able to. I was connecting with my grandmother who sat and held my big brother. He was born before I was born. He was the first child in our family and only lived 8 days. My grandmother sat in the hospital and held him on each of his 8 days. I was somehow connecting with her in this wisdom of the lineage, my lineage, of all of our lineage, of transitioning someone, of witnessing someone's transition. That's all the liminal. And that we go through some kind of portal that seems so deep inside us, but connects us with everything. You're already doing that. You're already doing that when you're connecting with stories about people you don't know. You're going into yourself to understand and to connect with people we don't know. So during this time of living here now through COVID, we're going to use stories to help us to contemplate, to experience, to discover both the very tangible essence of what living here now is, and also the liminal, this time between time, when this space between space where there is pure potentiality, and we don't want to cut it off like I did with Rascal by making the story too soon. So stay tuned. Living here now. These will all become available by the time our newsletter comes out, April 7th, 2020, maybe beforehand. If you're watching this in the future, much in the future, and you're not on our newsletter, jump on the website under education and videos, and you'll find these down below. Please let me know what this is like for you. What is it like for you in this moment to be living here now? Thank you, friends.